Welcome to Warpod, a podcast brought to you by Saferworld, asking experts from around the world about the impact of security policy on conflict. I'm Charlie Linney, Project Coordinator at Saferworld.
And I'm Lewis Brooks, UK Policy and Advocacy Advisor, also at Saferworld. We're recording this in July 2025, just after the month of strategic reviews by the UK government. 3 reviews that have a significant bearing on government policy for at least the next 3 years, if not beyond.
The first was the Strategic Defence Review, or SDR, which sets out a 10-year plan for reforming UK defence. It was commissioned at the start of the Labour government in August and led by 3 external experts, Lord Robertson, Dr Fiona Hill and General Sir Richard Barrons.
A few days later, we had the Comprehensive Spending Review, launched by Chancellor Richard Reeve, that lays out the next 3 years of government spending across all government departments.
And finally, we had the National Security Strategy, commissioned by the Prime Minister in February, which sets out the threat environment facing the UK and the government's response. In this episode, we'll look at all 3 of these reviews and explore how well they respond to the threats and challenges facing the UK. We're joined by Richard Reeve, the coordinator of Rethinking Security, a network of organisations, academics and activists working on security based on justice, cooperation and sustainability. We're also joined by Eva Tabbasam, Director of Gender Action for Peace and Security, or GAPS, a network of non-governmental organisations working on women, peace and security in the UK.
So Richard, let me start with you. What do you think are the key takeaways from these 3 reviews that all listeners should be aware of?
Thanks, Liz. I'd focus on 3 things, I think. The first one is the sequencing and process of the reviews. So normally you get a national security review that precedes a defence review. So you look at the full range of security threats or risks facing the UK, and you develop different kinds of strategies to respond to those. Now, some of those are going to be military, because the threats are essentially military, very hard security. Many of the others are not. So I'm talking about things like climate change, things like threats to people's personal well-being, all kinds of transnational challenges. What we've got this time is the defence review coming first. It's a much bigger, more comprehensive review than the National Security Strategy, which is very much an afterthought, done quickly, announced at a point where it was politically expedient for it to happen. So the defence review sets a very dark tone. There's an imminent threat of war. It talks about war readiness. It talks about developing an armour-clad, battle-ready UK. It's really, really dark stuff. Unfortunately, the National Security Strategy then responds very much to that militarised agenda. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do and look at the security of people in the broad. It doesn't even talk to people, not even experts, not society. There was no formal consultation process at all with that review, unlike previous ones. So very much the whole thing centres these military threats. It inflates them and it ignores or occludes a lot of other things that have been central in other ones, like climate change, like pandemics, like societal fragmentation, all kinds of things that should be there. The second thing, and I think this is the context of these reviews and what they ought to be responding to, is the central question: how does the UK become less dependent on a predatory, transactional, genocide-facilitating United States? Now, in many ways, that's not a new question, but it has become a lot more acute since the Trump return to the White House this year. And that was the panic situation that actually led to the National Security Strategy being commissioned in late February, when the US appeared to be walking away from Europe and Ukraine in particular. What we actually find is that both reviews, defence and national security, double down on the US relationship. They talk about sovereign capability and make nods to greater autonomy, not explicitly from the US, but that's the context. But actually the substance is very much doubling down on the US alliance, and the nuclear weapons issue is perhaps the biggest one of those. We're now talking about joining NATO nuclear sharing, which means basing and deploying air-launched relatively low-yield nuclear weapons from future British aircraft based in the UK. So that's all wrong. Thirdly, and perhaps most worrying, I think, and you see this particularly in the National Security Strategy, is the abandonment of the international legal order and the prioritisation of cooperation, which we've seen more of in the past. There's a very negative vision of security. So rather than building what we call positive security, so something that is more than a zero-sum game that benefits everyone. This doubles down on confrontation, competition, and conflict. It's pretty explicit that they think we're facing a war with Russia within the next 5-10 years. Personally, I don't agree with that. I think it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And within that, there's a surrender of the values and vision, which we've seen in previous ones. Now, of course, there's a lot of hypocrisy in these things, and you don't necessarily deliver on those values, get a lot of criticism for them. This time, let's avoid criticism, let's avoid accountability, let's not talk about values, let's not talk about vision, let's double down on preparing for war, which is really quite worrying.
I think one of the things that really struck me when reading the reviews is just building on your point there, Richard, not only the lack of values and this idea of moving away from the international rules-based order as we kind of know it, but also there's a sense of a lack of agency. A lot of the threats described in the very small context analysis section of the Strategic Defence Review, everything is very much framed as things that are happening to the UK. This decline is already happening, and therefore there doesn't seem to be any kind of will to push back on that, whether from a values approach or just in terms of being more proactive. For example, when it comes to climate change, there are things that the UK can do proactively to stop this trend, or at least try and reduce some of its impacts. Is that something that you took away when you read the pieces?
Yes, and I think the central agency dilemma of this, and actually all UK national security strategies, is the assumption of critical dependence on the US, that we cannot do without a US-led military alliance that protects the UK. That's what's come more into the open this year. It's not the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's important, but that was the defining feature of the last such reviews 2 years ago. That hasn't substantially changed in the past 2 years. What has changed is the naked transactionalism and rapacity of the US alliance. So we've got an inverse relationship on this. The US has said we must spend, and all NATO states, 5% of gross domestic product on security, including but not limited to defence. That means spending tens of billions of pounds more per year. That means, I think, about at least £2,000 per household more on security and defence for every UK household, and taking that away from social welfare. So the national security strategy is actually reverse engineered. It's not, we need to do this, how much does it cost? It's, we need to spend this much because the Trump administration says so. How do we then generate a narrative of threat that justifies that and slot everything else into that kind of agenda, even though, paradoxically, we know that the US is unreliable and is antithetical to the very values of liberalism on which European security and the NATO alliance is supposed to be based.
Eva, I can see you nodding a lot over there.
I should
what
just
do you
go
think?
home. Richard said everything.
What do you think? Do you have anything to add?
No, I think Richard's right. I think the reliance on alliances, but in particular the US, is worrying, especially given how unpredictable the US is. At least from my perspective, doing work on gender, we're seeing the rollback coming from the US. We're seeing, the Defence Secretary cancelling the Women, Peace and Security agenda, for example. And we see the watering down of language. And what we don't see is the UK, pen holders, for example, of the Women, Peace and Security, this party of international law. We don't see them putting themselves out there and pushing back against this. In fact, what we're seeing them do is follow them behind blindly, quite frankly. And that puts us actually in a more of an insecure position. Actually, that's a threat to our security and safety. There's this narrative of trying to fit this. And the reviews talk about this like whole of society approach and resilience. And actually, it's completely devoid of reality of what's happening in the UK, but also globally. And so the reviews don't address our reality. And I think it's a real concern because we're seeing that impact other things like spending, cuts to the work that we do or to our partners that we support.
You were talking there, Eva, about the reviews not being able to grapple really with how people are experiencing security in the UK and overseas. Are there any particular elements that you think were just not in how any of those reviews kind of conceptualize security?
Yeah, I mean, Richard mentioned climate change. I mean, I don't think, was there even a nod to climate change? I'm not sure. It's one of our key existential threats to us and the world, and just no sense of urgency around that. In fact, investing in tech and weapons that actually will do more harm. So no recognition of what is happening in that sense, or no solutions. I think there was some mention around migration, and migration, yes, it's a thing, but again, no understanding of root causes or actual solutions that will address the problem of migration. In the UK, we saw riots last year, riots that were stoked up by fear. We saw racist narratives, and again, not really addressing the root causes of the insecurity that led to instability and violence on our streets in the summer. It's just completely divorced in the reality of what's happening. And it goes to the point that Richard said about who did they speak to when they presented this vision of national security. From my understanding, there was no conversations with NGOs, civil society, both domestic and foreign, but also the public. Because I'm pretty sure if you went out on the streets and you spoke to the average person and they would tell you what their needs and priorities are, I'm not sure it's investing in weapons and tech. I mean, yes, there's room for that. We need that at some point in terms of addressing warfare that we're seeing now, or kind of conflict that we're seeing. But there's also room for everything else. And I think that's what happens when you are not coming at it from a holistic, rights-based, human-centered approach. That's what we're seeing with these 3 reviews.
One of the things that struck me was either in the SDR's threat assessment or in the national security strategies, there was no assessment of how women and men or other kinds of groups across society might experience security differently. And you've alluded to the riots, where clearly if you were asylum seekers in those hotels that were being picketed and firebombed, you experience security in the UK very differently to other kinds of people. I think one of the other things that struck me is there's a lot more gendered threats that we are sort of understanding more as a society. So the use of kind of AI in harassment of women or women politicians or women in public life. And we've seen that anywhere from targeting Ukrainian politicians to delegitimize them as part of that conflict, as well as seeing that in the UK. So I was just wondering if there was anything else that, from a gender point of view, that you think the reviews could have done better.
I mean, firstly, mention the Women, Peace and Security agenda, given the security in the title. And that allows you and gives you tools for making sure that you're addressing those most marginalised, but also making sure that it's inclusive. And you're also considering power dynamics. I think women was a footnote, which was quite disappointing. And then I think we got genders. I'm not sure what genders meant in the national security strategy. And then what it demonstrated was all the evidence that we know and we have, and that the UK has, being penholder and investing in this agenda for so many years, didn't make its way to forming this view. And so I think it completely didn't understand or didn't consider individuals. I think that, we are now seeing that, as I mentioned, in the spending review. So what we're being told is that gender will no longer have standalone programming. So, these are programmings that consider things like, what are the threats, digital threats to women human rights defenders, women parliamentarians? What are the evidence-based solutions to targeting that or combating that? There was a lot being done in terms of WPS on gender-based tech facilitated violence. How do we monitor that? How do we regulate that? What are the recommendations for us at home, but also globally for those, to make sure that it's accountability? Not only are we seeing a deprioritization of gender and this attempt to gender mainstream, but how can you do that if you don't have the money to invest? You don't have the capacity or the capabilities. And so, there's a lot that they say that they want to do, but, how can you do that if you don't have the resources? And I think on the migration aspect, again, these are asylum seekers, these are people fleeing from conflict. Often UK might have some responsibility to bear for some of these conflicts. Let's look at Afghanistan, for example. There is a responsibility here, and the UK shrinks that, I think, and doesn't acknowledge that in terms of when it's making such decisions. And so, everything for Keir Starmer's smash the gangs, and the boat crossings. I mean, one solution is have safe routes for settlement. You know, you don't see Ukrainians getting on a boat because there are passages for them to apply for asylum. And so, you know, a lot of it is, again, having this vision, creating a narrative, stoking fear and division, and that's not going to give us security or stability. So, you know, security can't just be reduced to military defense. There's a human cost and human needs and inequality, violence. That's what we're seeing. And the reduction in aid spend and the reduction of social and welfare, which is also what we're seeing, is going to really hurt people. And that is going to be a driver for more violence and more conflict.
So we've just talked a lot about how these reviews analyse the international security environment and the impact on the UK. I wonder, Richard, if you could tell us a little bit how you think government is set up to respond to some of these challenges, and how do the reviews play into that?
I think like any security review, it's a response to what has recently happened rather than what is actually in the future. Now, obviously, in this context, they're particularly responding to Russian aggression in Ukraine and the idea that Europe may be facing a larger Russian, potentially Iranian or maybe Chinese or North Korean threat in the longer term. But they're very focused on this sort of current geostrategic interstate rivalry. It's not to say that isn't going to continue in the future, but it does ignore climate change in particular and other transnational issues, and it ignores the prospects of cooperation on those. So there's a phrase in the National Security Strategy where, it's one of the only ones that mentions climate change, where it talks about the possibility or probability of ecosystem collapse, and it moves on. Ecosystem collapse is, I think, probably the most existential challenge we could face, short of complete nuclear destruction in a few hours type conflict. And it isn't a hypothetical. It's not an accidental scenario. It's actually happening. Climate breakdown is happening. Ecological collapse is happening. And we can actually sketch out timelines for that, not with certainty, but with a reasonable degree of probability based on high scientific consensus. But then we ignore it. So this isn't a sustainable security strategy. It's a short-term strategy to deal with a specific military threat and technological change issues in the sort of near to mid-term. So it's neither sustainable nor comprehensive, I think, in those terms.
Eva, in terms of these reviews, do they set the UK up to respond adequately to the current security environment, or are key interventions missing, or how do you see the UK being able to respond?
I mean, if you even look at the reviews in itself, right, and there's a lot of like commitment to like investing in tech and weapons and so on. I mean, firstly, where is the money coming from? I mean, yes, they've increased, but I don't think they've set out a clear plan how they expect to do this. And there's no clear allocation of like where this money is going to come from and how they're going to be able to upfront that, as well as do the 5% to NATO, and while we're also seeing cuts domestically. And so I don't think it's a long-term vision at all. I'm just not sure how realistic or achievable it is. But then on top of that, as I already mentioned, I don't think it responds to the international security climate for the UK or globally. It doesn't even address the crises and conflicts that we're seeing. The world is literally on fire. We've got a genocide happening in Palestine. You know, the UK is selling arms. There's no understanding really of the reality of the situation. And again, as I mentioned, with the withdrawal or the reduction in aid, right, which, you know, once you take away the commitments to multilaterals, and then also remember they're also still using that for asylum costs. And so when you really think about the totality of what's left, and in terms of the prevention that we need to do, and you know, the other work that needs to happen alongside this in terms of community peace building and more, I just don't think that these reviews really address the current situation or are going to even address some of the issues that we're facing and seeing. And, you know, on top of that, you know, I mentioned about the lack of like a human security approach or a rights-based approach. And often we're always told like, oh, but there's got to be trade-offs, right? There's got to be trade-offs. Like we need to invest in security because war's at our front door. And you know, so, you know, we need to do this and we know better than you, right? We can see this. And so we need to do this. But I actually think that, no, there has to be a balanced, holistic approach. And I just don't think that they're getting that right. And, you know, we need transparency and accountability. We need oversight mechanisms for some of this. And there's just nothing of that in any of these documents, or if we're hearing any of that from government, we're not. And there needs to be proportionality, and we're not seeing that at all either. And so I just don't, I'm not convinced that these reviews are responding well to the international security climate.
And I wonder, just to pick up on that and take it one step further, can you tell us a bit more about what you think the implications of that would be, of the UK not kind of responding adequately to the challenges of the international security environment, the real challenges and the drivers of conflict? Because I think one of the things that struck me in the reviews is this, and I think we mentioned it at the start, this whole of society approach to conflict and to warfare, to transform the UK as a whole nation into a war-fighting, ready for conflict nation. And I think that in itself, I think you mentioned it earlier, Richard, becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where you prepare for war, therefore you are potentially more likely to go to war, because not only do you have the resources, but mentally it's something that's in the public conscience. And so, Eva, I wonder if you could just take your argument one step forwards and tell us what you think the implications are in this kind of militarised society that we're seeing now of the UK potentially failing to respond to some of these challenges.
So I think from a GAPS perspective and from the work that we do, we're seeing direct consequences to our partners. Okay, so to the women rights organisations, to the civil society organisations who are on the front lines doing life-saving work, preventing violence and conflict, doing the peace-building community work, addressing the needs of their communities, often filling the gap by states and the multilaterals or the INGOs, because quite frankly, none of them do a great job or a better job than, say, what WROs or CSOs can do. And already we're seeing, there was an analysis by UN Women in July about how a majority of these organisations in 6 months, they're not going to exist. And all the work that they're doing, often on shoestring budgets anyway, they're just not going to exist anymore. And so when we really think about conflict and crises, that's going to increase. Take conflict-related sexual violence, for example. That doubled last year, and no response to scale up in response to that doubling. And so we're seeing that as a consequence. We will see more migration, definitely. People will be fleeing, not only from violence and conflict, but also from climate change. If we're not addressing climate change, we won't be addressing, people moving for safety and security. I think sometimes we see ourselves as a little island and we don't really think about how we have to work globally. There's global cooperation. We need to do that. And, Baroness Chapman, when she was in front of the IDC, I think it was, and she said, we're not...
For those who don't know, Eva's referring to Baroness Chapman, the current UK Development Minister, who appeared before the International Development Committee.
Baroness Chapman, when she was in front of the IDC, I think it was, and she said, we're not a charity. It's not about being a charity. It's about global solidarity. It's about also taking responsibility for some of these issues that we're seeing, the wars that we're seeing, the conflicts that actually the UK is arming. And so these are the consequences. And then when you look at the UK and when you look what's happening now, where inequality is getting deeper, we're seeing more people struggling, you're seeing cuts to welfare and social care. This will create instability. This is not being taken into consideration.
Yeah, if you look at this Strategic Defence Review, there's nothing they want to cut. It's a classic prioritisation problem. You want to do loads of new things, new tech, more fighter aircraft, more tanks, formations, keep doing what you're always doing, plus new stuff. Even when pushed by the Defence Committee and others, the reviewers, they couldn't say what they wanted to stop doing to fund some of this stuff. Now, fine, if we're really going to double the defence budget or security budget, maybe there is money for all that stuff. But it means cuts elsewhere, exactly what Eva was saying. It's not cost-free. It means cutting back on social spending, on welfare, on education, on health, on all the stuff that actually boosts social cohesion and resilience. Now, resilience is a key feature in the national security strategy, or it's supposed to be, but it misses out, actually, in talking about a whole of society approach, it misses out society. And it doesn't recognise quite how fragmented, how fragile, how brittle the UK is as a society that needs to be resilient to this kind of stuff.
I think it's a really interesting point, and certainly when I was reading it, there's these little snippets that maybe you can cook an argument and think about that in more depth. So there was a piece about considering, say, attacks on society by those that previously they would have talked about inspired by either kind of far right or jihadi terrorism. I think more recently, I think it's the National Security Strategy talks about those who are just obsessed by violence as an idea. So there are these kind of moments where the NSS does kind of go, actually, we do need to think about society and protecting it from, if you like, challenges within rather than necessarily Russian aggression or cyber attacks or those kinds of things. But it never goes further than that, as you said. However, it does strike me that the arms industry is included in its understanding of whole of society. There are, in the Strategic Defence Review, several proposals to increase the engagement between society and the military and to boost recruitment or to make recruitment more efficient. There are also rhetoric about working much more closely with the arms industry in terms of defence production. I wonder, Richard, what your response was reading that side of the NSS and the SDR.
There's this idea of a defence dividend, which runs through recent government rhetoric about defence. The idea that we will reindustrialise the country, reinvigorate the economy by spending more on defence and security. So what you might call a military Keynesianism argument, which even if you want a more militarised policy and society, I think is problematic because it's fairly obvious from the figures that spending on military defence does not have the same multiplier effect as spending on education or investment in civil industries and most things. Occasionally you get something transformative in tech or in industry, but overall, no, you get a dampening effect. So you're actually degrowing the economy, if that's a word, suppressing the economy, suppressing growth by investing in military industries rather than alternatives, as well as taking away from social spending that generally makes people feel better about their social contract with the government, which again is problematic.
And so I think that leads us on quite nicely to start thinking about what would a more sustainable route to security look like and how can the UK get there from where it is now?
So for me, and we've been doing a lot of work on this at Rethinking Security through our alternative security review, and we'll have we call a sustainable security strategy coming out in the autumn. We think you need a 3-level approach for a sustainable security strategy. One of those is the sort of international level, which here would be called national security. I would think of it more as shared security, a more cooperative approach that centres the United Nations, the UN Charter and international cooperation on all kinds of issues and international law, as opposed to what we've called a rules-based international order based on rules that we have written. An international legal order, which is genuinely and not selectively law-bound and which involves all countries in developing and honouring those laws. That's the sort of the international shared security level, which we should be looking at. But it also needs to look at 2 different levels. It needs to start from an idea of human security within our own society, so well-being. And well-being is actually the definition that the National Security Strategy here gives for the national interest, developing the well-being of the British people at home and abroad. So why not ask them? And when you do ask people, what they want is centred on their own well-being, their communities, their access to some forms of social assistance, to being able to afford their rent, their food, basic needs, things that people are just really precarious and struggling with and feel is getting worse. And that's what drives these divisions in society. It also includes, as part of human security, political rights, political security, democracy, which is blatantly failing at the moment, but which is ignored. These strategies talk about suppressing, really, civil society and protest rather than accessing and understanding society. So that's the human security level. And beyond these sort of human and shared security levels is the planetary level. So we've got to get serious about ecological security and the carrying capacity of the planet, because without that, nothing else works. But we've got blithe suggestions that we should probably do something about ecosystem collapse and then move back to geostrategy. No, that's central concern of security strategies. It should be front and centre. And again, it calls for that common security cooperation across the board to do something about this. You can't do this through competition, confrontation and conflict.
Thanks, Richard. Eva, I'm going to turn to you for a similar take on that question, but I guess a lot of what you and I do and how we collaborate day to day in our work is around advocacy and trying to make the case for the UK to take a more sustainable approach to security. Do you see any opportunities, hooks, positive windows to take this government towards that more sustainable approach to security that Richard's just talked to? I'm going to kind of appeal to the optimist somewhere in your character, I think, Eva, see what you think.
Oh, I don't know. Honestly, no. I'm really sorry. I feel like we keep hitting a brick wall. I mean, so, we'll keep pushing. We'll keep reminding them of their commitments. For example, at least for us, they're a pen holder of WPS. It's the 25th anniversary. We've got 2030, Beijing, there are lots of anniversary years.
For those who don't know, Eva's referring to the anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action on Gender Equality.
We'll keep trying to use that as a hook, but it seems like they are just not wanting to hear at all. And so it does make it a bit difficult. So I'm not optimistic, but we will keep trying. We are also seeing this, complete shift to national security. We're seeing that in terms of inside government. So we're seeing departments change now, right, titled to migration, conflict prevention and security. We're seeing some of the work on WPS also shifting in terms of following UK trajectory around national security. So what we're trying to do is fit some of the work that we do. Okay, so if you look at prevention, how can we make the argument around prevention that fits national security, but we're still trying to look at it from a holistic approach, trying to get them to think about it a bit widely. So really working with working level government officials to really get them to influence their policy and then eventually programming. So, I'll keep trying that. We'll keep trying that. I'm not sure how much it will make a dent. But, and then we've got party conferences coming up. And also, one thing I must say, elections, right? Local council elections coming up. That will also, I hope, give them a kick to, say, because what we're seeing that's being polled or projected for that, hopefully that will give them an idea that, this is not working, this is not what society wants, make some changes. But I'm not convinced that will make the argument. But I just want to go to Richard's vision for a sustainable security strategy, which I agree with. But I would just say that, kind of on the shared security aspect, that shared security, I would question for whom, which countries, who is involved in that vision, because there is selective application, for example, of when law applies or law doesn't apply, or when human rights applies and human rights doesn't apply. And thinking about the global south that are often affected by visions of the global north. And so I think about, when we talk about like alliances and partnerships, we need positive partnerships. If this shared security is with the current vision of Trump right now, for example, or the US, again, that has to be broken down a little bit more to gain trust and support both domestically and internationally. You can't be selective. You have to be consistent in your values and your principles. And that needs to be part of the shared security so as to not repeat or perpetuate what we're seeing already, which is global north dictate or, partnership based on extraction of resources.
I'm usually critical of these strategies, but if I could say something optimistic, or uncharacteristically optimistic to end on. The world is what we make it. That's what politics is about. The UK has enormous responsibility for a lot of bad things, some good things, but a lot of bad things. But it's also a privileged and relatively powerful state still that can make positive change happen. And our politicians can do that. They've chosen not to. They've doubled down on a lot of very negative narratives on security, I think. That doesn't have to be the case. We have resources. We can challenge on these things. We can start at home. And that starts by asking people, It's not just our polling, our studies as Rethinking Security that suggest this. Any of the mainstream pollsters, when you look at what people actually value, it's the same things. It's about community. It's about services. It's not really about defense. This isn't the issue that people are overwhelmingly concerned with. So if you start politics, what people really care about, there are votes in that. Now, the media has a big role in communicating that, and it does so in a very skewed way at the moment and historically. But I don't think it's the case that people are pushing for these very negative security policies. So I'm not wholly optimistic, but I think our media system, our electoral system skews things in a certain way. If we get to grips with those, and I don't see a lot of appetite for that from the current government. But people, I think, believe in this stuff. And I think if we follow people, there is every possibility of positive change. Not the urgency that we need it because of all the barriers in the way, but I think people do want to be at the centre of security strategies. They don't want a confrontational, conflict-prone world. They don't want to go to war in the next 5-10 years like these strategies suggest we're going to do. So people need to turn this around, and that needs to start now. I think it's worth considering the politics of these security strategies and policies, of why Labour is centering security in its political offering currently. Securing Britain's future is the tagline that's written on Keir Starmer's podium currently. And I think that's the issue that they think lays best with voters against Reform UK at the moment. That Reform looks weak on international security in Russia in particular, and that Starmer is relatively popular when he talks about this stuff. You've seen the polls. The only thing that has really increased Labour's polling in the past 6 months or so, and only by 1 or 2%, but still slightly reversing the decline, has been times when he's talked a lot about security. So when Trump seemed to be abandoning Ukraine at the beginning of March, it went up slightly. Just looking around these strategies released in June, it went up slightly and then went down again a bit, or at least levelled off. So it's the only issue they think cuts through to voters. But the general decline of Labour's vote, I think, is related to decline in social spending and people feeling alienated from the party as the party of the people and spending on welfare. That hasn't happened. So while they're seeing an increase around talking tough on security, that's not reversing the general decline on other forms of human security that they're not acting tough on, shall we say.
It's also interesting that looking at some of the recent polling is suggesting that actually the issues that their voter base caring about are not defence, and it is these other issues that you mentioned. And also on aid, I've seen polling that suggests that actually, although some reform-leaning voters are very happy to cut the aid budget, it's not a salient issue for them. Whereas for voters on the left, they are anti-cutting the aid budget, and it is a salient issue for them. And so I think, again, some of these things aren't necessarily playing into the way in which the polling in general is, and what issue voters find to be key is actually playing out. So yeah, it's a really important point.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Richard. It's nice to end on a somewhat positive or optimistic note here. I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for both of you. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation.
Cheers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Warpod from Saferworld. This series was produced by Andy O'Connor and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. You can listen to all previous episodes and catch up on the latest releases wherever you get your podcasts by searching for and following Warpod. You can also find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @war_pod and @Saferworld. And to find out more about our work, visit saferworld-global.org.